Hi, and welcome back to the African Cinema Podcast. This is your host, Tendai, and welcome to the next chapter in our Projector Dreams series. In our last episode, we explored how Egypt built a cinematic empire during its golden studio era. Today, we turn the lens to what came after. This is the story of Egyptian cinema from 1960 to 1999. 4 turbulent decades where an entire industry wrestled with change, contradiction, and creativity. It's a story of revival, censorship, politics, private funding, feminist resistance, and what happens when a camera has to capture a country trying to reinvent itself. Now we begin in the 1960s. Under General Gamal Abdel Nasser's rule, Egyptian cinema had become a state-controlled apparatus, nationalized, idealistic, and deeply tied to the country's socialist vision. Between 1963 and 1971, the government produced most of the country's films. These were stories of national pride, anti-colonial struggle, and rural modernization. Melodrama met manifesto, in what many remember as a second golden age. But even in the 1960s, cracks had started to appear. The devastating loss in the Six-Day War of 1967 sent shockwaves through every layer of society. Confidence in state narratives began to crumble. Disillusionment set in and would only deepen with Nasser's death in 1970. Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, launched the Infita, or open door policy, aimed at liberalizing Egypt's economy. But that policy didn't stop at markets. It opened the door to Western influence, growing religious convertism, and a whole new way of thinking about film. Sadat scaled back state production, filmmakers had to turn to the private sector, and suddenly, Egypt's screens were flooded with cheaply made, formula-driven productions. Where the 60s had volume and vision, the 70s had volume and little else. Critics began to refer to this period as a creative low point. Most striking, though, was how cinema became a tool to reshape memory. Nasser was lionized, was now portrayed as a dictator. Films under Sadat painted his era as one of fear, torture, and failure, reframing history to legitimize Sadat's new direction. Censorship didn't end, it evolved, and so did culture. As Western consumerism took root, many Egyptians turned to Islam to reasset identity. Filmmakers mirrored this shift, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes defiantly. One of the boldest voices of the time came in 1975 with Said Mazouk's I Want a Solution. The film followed a well-off woman seeking divorce from her manipulative husband. More than just a legal drama, it became a national statement on Egypt's flawed personal status laws. Its release coincided with real-life legal debates. It was feminist, raw, and deeply political, laying the groundwork for a new kind of Egyptian cinema. By the early 1980s, something remarkable began to happen. Out of the fatigue and frustration of the previous decade, a new generation of filmmakers emerged, poised, political, and unafraid. This was Egypt's new realism. They filmed on location, they cast non-actors, they chose stories about bus drivers, street vendors, mothers, soldiers, and teachers. They didn't flinch from shame or poverty or bureaucracy. They weren't afraid to challenge the system. Directors like Atef El-Tayeb, Mohammed Khan, and Daoud Abdel-Sayed helped lead this change. Their films didn't present perfect heroes, they presented frustrated, flawed people stuck in the gears of a changing country. Take Bus Drivers, made in 1982, where a former soldier turned taxi driver navigates family betrayal and a corrupt economy. Or The Innocent, made in 1986, where a wrongly accused engineer is swallowed by Egypt's brutal prison system. Both films are gripping, both films are gut-wrenching, and both were censored. The Innocent had its final scene cut for decades, a moment of rebellion against institutional cruelty that Mubarak's government deemed too dangerous. The 1980s also saw women take center stage, on screen and behind the camera. Stories expanded, characters deepened, and filmmakers didn't shy away from how law and society punished female agency. In The Iron Woman, made in 1987, and The Woman and the Law, made in 1988, Women fought corrupt legal systems and patriarchal violence. Yet, not all narratives ended in despair. In The File on Samia Sharawi, made in 1988, a woman takes control of her fate, disrupting expectations. Women directors began to emerge. al-Dughaydi would rise to prominence in the 90s, but the shift began here, with women challenging the male gaze and rewriting gender roles. By the late 1980s, a strange nostalgia took hold. As Egypt faced unemployment, rising Islamism, and cultural fragmentation, filmmakers began to reframe Nasser not as a tyrant, but as a symbol of lost stability. The past, once vilified, became refuge. Films like We Are the People of the Bus, made in 1979, and The Guilty, made in 1976, showed this tension, blending critique with longing. The 1980s didn't start a new revolution. They carried forward the struggle. Hosni Mubarak's Egypt offered more economic liberalization, but it also came with tighter control on political expression. Piracy exploded. Satellite television and VCRs reshaped how Egyptians consumed film. Theaters struggled to compete as homes filled with reruns of Mexican telenovelas and Turkish dramas. But in between this quiet media war, Egyptian filmmakers held their ground. Realism remained in the lifeblood of serious cinema. The heroes of the decade weren't just artists, they were survivors. Daoud Abdel-Sayed's Kit Kat, made in 1991, was a breath of melancholical magic. Centered on Sheikh Hosni, a blind man in a crumbling Cairo neighborhood, the film explored desire, disappointment, and defiance. Hosni dreams of riding a motorbike, smoking hash, and escaping the weight of his limited world. In doing so, he reflected the emotional fatigue of a whole generation. al-Dughaydi's Cheap Flesh, made in 1995, caused controversy for its frank portrayal of women navigating economic survival through transactional relationships. Bold and unapologetic, it forced viewers to reckon with class, power, and gender in a post-socialist economy. Other directors emerged with equally potent voices. Radwan El-Kashef's The City, made in 1999, followed a young man who flees to France, only to return to Egypt with shattered illusions. The film was visually poetic but brutally honest, a meditation on migration, identity, and return. Yousry Nasrallah, a prodigy of Youssef Chahine, carried his mentor's fusion of politics and beauty into a new era. His 1995 film, Mercedes, portrayed a man's search for his brother through surreal, Noir-like Cairo. The narrative might have been abstract, but its themes, social fragmentation, alienation, and the failure of wealth were all too real. With state funding drying up, many filmmakers turned to co-production with Europe, particularly France and Germany. International festivals became lifelines. These films weren't always blockbusters at home, but they garnered acclaim abroad, keeping Egyptian cinema in the global conversation. Meanwhile, at home, the line between commercial and independent cinema grew sharper. Action comedies and melodramas dominated box offices, but tucked in the margins were films that asked harder questions. Audiences changed too. As video clubs replaced cinemas and internet crept into urban life, younger Egyptians consumed stories differently. The big screen was no longer the only screen. And yet, through it all, the censorship, the economic strain, the distribution crises, the camera kept rolling, because Egypt wasn't done telling its story. Now, from 1960 to 1999, Egyptian cinema reinvented itself more than once. It began as a stage tool, became a vehicle of revision, morphed into a realist movement, and eventually entered the global art house conversation. It captured the rise and fall of ideologies, the everyday battles of its people, and the voices, especially of women, fighting to be heard. Through war, censorship, deregulation, and digital change, it endured. Next time on Project Dreams, we step into the 2000s and beyond. A time of revolution, digital disruption, and new wave of creativity. Until then, keep your eyes open. The reel never really stops. And this has been the African Cinema Podcast. Thanks for listening. Ciao.